Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Dave Peaty, and I am the current board president of Publishing Professionals Network. We are so pleased about the excitement at tonight's session. Debbie Berne talking about book design for editors. I think we had something like 450 people sign up, which is amazing. And I know that some people may be disappointed because they might not be able to join. You'll get to see this recording on video, but Debbie will also be sending out an email to everyone who has registered, because she's going to be doing more of these sessions. The popularity has made it clear she's got a book coming out. She's got a lot to share with a lot of people. So I'll let her talk about that, but not, if you couldn't make it, not to worry. We'll have information in the link. The only thing to know about the video is it's only going to be available to people who registered on Eventbrite, and it's only going to be available for 1 month because she's going to be doing more of these sessions. So I want to get that out of the way. And I wanted to also say that I'm hoping you'll put in the chat where you're from. Just a quick shout out and hello. If you have questions as you listen to what Debbie has to share, hold off on putting them in the chat. Wait until we get to the Q&A part, because it'll be too hard for us to kind of cycle back through the chat panel to kind of pick and choose what's a question and what's a wonderful comment. So hold off on the questions until we get to that point. Just a quick little bit of housekeeping. Publishing Professionals Network is an all-volunteer nonprofit, and what we do is we are basically a community of people involved in publishing who are here to support each other, to make publishing a better experience for all of us, and to really help those who are entering the field to share our knowledge and experience. And we really hope that if you are not a PPN member, that you join. It's super cheap. It's $25 for an individual for a year. Great benefits. I won't go into that now. You can see it on our website, which is going to be put in the chat, but it's pubpronetwork.org. And we do things like this. We try to do them sort of around once a month, but in April we have a conference. It's an in-person conference here in Berkeley, California at the David Brower Center. You can find out about that on our website. And then we also have a book show in October. We had our 50th book show back in 2022, and it's a wonderful book show. But we do lots of things to really support the publishing community. And if you're interested in being a part of that and want to join, that's great. If you're not ready to join now, that's fine. But please know that you can also just sign up to be on the mailing list to find out about all the cool things that we're doing. So I'm going to unpin myself and turn it over to Debbie. She can talk a little bit about
Hey, Dave, before you do that, sorry to interrupt. We're at 100 participants and there's a bunch of people in the waiting room.
I will send a message in the chat letting them know that we have reached our maximum.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's exciting, and I'm sure they're going to be disappointed, but I'll explain the situation and that they'll have opportunities in the future. Thank you for pointing that out. So that's Peter Goodman, who's also on the PPN board, who's here helping out, and David Van Ness, who's also on the PPN board, is helping out. So you can ask if you are having any kind of problems. You can point it out in the chat and they'll try to answer your questions. So let me remove my spotlight. And I am going to spotlight Debbie. Thank you, Debbie, for being here.
Sure. Thank you, Dave. Hi. Wait, I'm going to start my thing here. Okay. Hi. Welcome. I'm Debbie. I'm a professional book designer. And it's funny to be a professional book designer because lots of times when I tell people what I do, they look at me like, you mean you draw the covers? Most people have never thought about the fact that books are designed, and many authors are in the dark about the design of their own books, and even editors can be a little fuzzy on what the designers they're working with are actually doing. Like, besides picking the fonts, what are we doing? So today I'm going to fill you in a little bit. I've just written a book about this. It's about book design and it's for editors and authors. And I wrote it because it seemed like the people on the editorial side who I work with didn't know as much as they could about the design of their own projects. And there's not really been a place to go for that information. And the thing is, what you do as editors impacts what we do as designers. So if you understand what we're doing, we can work together better, we can have a better process, and we can make better books. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Obviously, I'm not going to cover all of book design in the next hour. I'm only going to touch on cover design, just like a little bit, because that's its own huge topic and really its own thing. What I am going to talk about are 10 things that I wish editors knew about book design. And I don't think anything I'm going to say is going to be shocking to you. You're going to recognize it all. But I hope I can help you see design and the logic behind what designers are doing a little more clearly. And as Dave said, there's going to be time at the end for questions. You should hold off putting your questions into the chat until the end, and then you can put them in there. A few caveats before I begin. I'm going to be talking about printed books here. I'm not sure if you know, but ebooks are also designed and they're also books. But today, what I'm talking about are printed books. And a lot of what I'm going to show in my slides is my own work, but I'm also using other designers' work as examples. So I just want to be really clear. Not everything I'm showing is my own work. And a last caveat, there's some publishing jargon ahead. This talk is book design for editors, and I'm assuming that the people listening will understand basic publishing terms. And if you're not an editor, because you're like my mom and dad, try to stay with us. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So, because you can't talk about design without pictures. So hold on a second here. Let's see. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. Okay, idea number one. The manuscript is going to be a book. Obviously, you know that. That's what you're doing, right? You're making books. What I want you to see is that the manuscript is not a book, because a book is a designed thing. And on the writing and editing side, we can get so into our Word documents that we kind of forget this isn't the book. And I know this is true from writing my own book. I loved my Word document. I spent so much time in there. I love my 12-point Times New Roman. I love my paragraphs and ragged lines. And I love the verticality, like the endless scrolling. Scrolling through your work is very satisfying, but that's not how books work. They look more like this. They're two facing pages. They're mostly not in 12-point Times New Roman, and they're definitely not in a long scroll. The pieces of text are in a really different relationship to each other in a book than in a Word document. And the inside of a book is so interesting because it's something that all of us are so familiar with as people who work in publishing, but just also as readers. We're always looking at the inside of books all the time. But most people are paying no attention to how the inside of a book looks. And it might not seem like there's that much design going on in there, especially like in a narrative book like this. But of course, there is a lot of design going on. Even on the most straightforward spread, designers are thinking about so many things. And I'm going to point out a few things. First, the page is like a picture inside a frame. The text block is the picture and the margins are the frame. What does a picture frame do? It shows you where to look. It directs your attention. It also acts as a boundary. It's like a force field. The world of the book is in here and the rest of the world is out there. And margins are not all the same size. Designers think about what size their margins should be. It's basically the first thing I think about when I start a design. And it can depend on a lot of factors, like how long the manuscript is, how many pages have been allotted, but also how we want the page to feel. Bigger margins let in more air. There's just less printing on the page, and that feels a certain way. The bigger margins are also a bigger boundary. And there's other visual things here that I'm sure you're noticing. The size of the type is smaller in the book in the front, and the lines are closer together. They also use different fonts, although that might not be totally clear. So the size of the page, the size of the margins, the choice of font, the size of the font, the length of the lines, the space between the lines, how the running heads and page numbers look and where they go. These are all aspects of the book that readers almost never think about, but which designers think deeply about. And we think about it because the design of the page is creating a space for the reader, for the reading. And we want that space to be comfy. We want it to feel like a good match for the material. And we want the reading to be effortless. In most books, interior design completely disappears. You aren't thinking about it because it's working. And that leaves readers free to focus on what they came for, which is the content. But what I'm suggesting to you is to pay attention with some part of your editor's brain to this fact that the Word document is not the end of the road. There's going to be some other steps after that. The document is going to transform. It's going to be a book. And it's worthwhile to think about that while you're still in the document phase. Now, you might say, I don't really know how to think about that. But you know who does know how to think about that? Designers. Okay, so hold that thought. I'm going to come back to it. Number 2, specs or design. A book is an object, and specs are the instructions for making that object. Specs are a book size, its format, its paper stock, whether it has a jacket, if it's a paperback, whether it has flaps. And specs are a funny thing in publishing because they are agreed upon really early in the process, maybe even when you're still deciding whether to bid for a book, and you're creating a P&L and you're putting in the specs to see what the printing cost is going to be. So the specs are tied to the budget, and they're also determined by what's available from the printer you're using and by what method you're printing, digital or offset, and by the conventions at your publishing house, where you may have standard specs for certain kinds of books. In big publishing houses, production occupies its own department. In smaller ones, there may be a production manager. My point is that printer specs are thought of somewhat separate from design. They're thought of as production. When readers are browsing, like at a bookstore, a book's size and its format, what it's like physically, are some of the first things they notice about it. And they kind of notice without noticing that they're noticing. They're taking in all this information about what the book is, based on whether it's a paperback or a hardcover, whether it has a jacket or is paper over boards, how the cover or jacket feels when they touch it, and how big it is. Trim size and proportion have personality. Most new hardcovers are 6 by 9 inches. That's how people expect their new hardcovers to look. But not all of them look that way. Shave off an inch, you've got a different feel. Thick books are different than skinny ones. Mass market, completely different vibe than trade paperback. Gift books are often intentionally small or sometimes have surprising proportions. Art and photography, culture books, they're often really big. I was just talking to an editor friend about a book that she was developing, and she was saying, well, it's mostly text, but there's these beautiful color photographs. And I was like, well, what size are you going to make it? Is it an art book or is it a reading book? And what kind of paper are you going to use? Coated paper is better for images, but no one wants to read a book on coated paper like in bed. These kinds of production decisions are design decisions, and they're going to make a huge difference in how a reader is going to understand what a book is and how to engage with it. And it's not just how a book looks in the store. Books should also feel good in your hands. I have designed so many books where I like what I've done and I like what the author's done, but when it shows up, the paper feels cheap or it's bright white or the printing is bad. The binding sometimes feels too tight. You have to like pry it open. To me, those books are basically ruined. If you order a book online and it comes and the printing looks like it was done on a Xerox machine, it's just like yuck. Books are not only there to catch a reader's attention, but to be held and to be read. So decent paper, decent printing, they're the minimum considerations. It doesn't matter how brilliant a book is, if it looks and feels crappy, who's going to want it? And then really thinking about what you're telling readers about a book from its look and feel. And an interesting package doesn't have to mean a higher cost. Maybe a change in size or getting rid of a jacket could take a book to an interesting place. Maybe not. But for every book, it's worth asking, how should this book be? Okay, number 3. I don't need to tell you that designers use type. And type is basically a fancy way of saying fonts. That's not exactly true, but it's true enough. Everyone loves to talk about fonts because it's a part of design that's familiar. You use fonts in your Word documents, and many of you know something about the different kinds of fonts. So you know that body copy is generally set in a serif font. And you know that sans serif is the other one. Italics are for titles. Scripts are often used for romance novels. A casual script can make something seem handmade or unassuming. And black letter is mostly used these days for the logos of heavy metal bands. but there's more to type than that. Typography is a deep subject. People spend their entire lives studying type, writing books about type, and designing fonts. When I started researching typography for my own book, I really couldn't believe how many books there are about typography, and I wanted to read all of them. Every week, a new book would show up at my house, and my family was like, oh, how interesting, a book about serifs. Designers sometimes get uptight when authors or editors suggest fonts for a project because there is so much to know, and non-designers often don't know what they don't know. I'm going to tell you a few things. Fonts work on a lot of levels. For instance, many fonts are really old. In Europe, typography started with the printing press around 1450, and we still work with fonts that are based on the type of that earliest period. What you're looking at here is the earliest version of the font we now call Bembo, which is so pretty, so pretty. And even new fonts, they're always looking back at what came before and building on what's already been done. So fonts have histories and traditions of use. They also have creators. Designers might know that Paul Renner designed the font Futura, the same way that you know that Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa. And you can see there's all these things to know about Futura. Most type is based on handwriting, but Futura is based on geometry. And you can see that in the shapes of the letters. One of the things people notice about Futura is that its O is like a perfect circle. So Futura has these specific visual qualities and a particular history around it. It was also used in these iconic ads for Volkswagen. Every font has a story around its creation, and if it's been around long enough, around its use. Here's the font Lydian. It has a distinctive look, sort of like it was drawn with a calligraphic pen. This font is from 1938, and it was used in the 1950s for the covers of the Nancy Drew series of books. Okay, so dated, not particularly cool, and it kind of disappeared for the next 50 years. But it's having a total resurgence on the covers of literary fiction and other highbrow kinds of books. I could have shown you a dozen more books that have come out in the last 3 years with Lydian on the cover. A lot of times when authors want a particular font or a style of font, I think, of course they do. That's what's hot right now. And this kind of thing happens all the time. Fonts and type styles are trendy and they go in and out of fashion. Of course, there's classic fonts that are used again and again, but even classic fonts come from a lot of different eras. There's classic fonts from the 16th century and there's ones from the 20th century. And maybe they don't look that different to you, but to designers, they each have their own vibe, and we would choose one or another based on what we're going for. Fonts also have differences in functionality. Something designers look carefully at is the character set of the font. So that's what non-English characters do they have? What diacritics do they have? What ligatures do they have? What punctuation marks? And how do their numbers look? How do their fractions look? I design a lot of cookbooks, and in cookbooks, how clear the fractions are is super important. I've disqualified fonts I really like because their fractions weren't clear enough. I like to look at the commas in the fonts I'm thinking about. There's a lot of commas on a text page, and it matters to me what they look like. So there's a lot to think about when picking a font for a book. Here's the same text set in 6 different fonts. Any of these could work for Dickens. Different designers will make different choices, and those will be based on what I've just talked about. A font's history, its creator, its functionality, and obviously how it looks, and also how it's positioned. What is this book, and what are we trying to express? Are we trying to make it feel modern and emphasize its relevance? Do we want to emphasize its timelessness? The answers to those questions would lead me to different fonts. And how do I even know what we're trying to do? Better talk to the editor. My type hero is a guy named Robert Bringhurst. He wrote an amazing book called The Elements of Typographic Style. And this is how he describes matching a font with a text. Letters have tone, timbre, and character, just like words and sentences do. The moment a text and a typeface are chosen, 2 streams of thought, 2 rhythmical systems, 2 personalities intersect. Okay, but which font is only the most basic question, because once we choose our fonts, we're going to use them. We don't just throw them on the page. We use type to show relationships. So here, I want to show what's the relationship between the word spruce pine and the Latin name Pinus glabra, and then the characteristics of that tree. And of course, I have to understand that relationship myself before I can express it visually. So I can use bold, there's italic, there's script, that's italic, that's script. There's small caps, there's all caps, there's the relative size of the different pieces, there's the relative boldness, and there's which fonts I'm putting together. How different or similar are they? So style is expressing function and relationships, but it's also doing something else, right? Because it's also showing voice. The different choices have different personalities. Some feel more serious, some are more playful. I mean, there's an endless amount of voices. So here's another example. This is an ingredient list for a coffee cake. Notice how the different styling is working here. The heading is bold and big. Oops. The subheadings are also bold, but not as bold and not as big. And then we have the items in the list in the same font as the heading, but much smaller and a lighter weight. So there's a lot going on. Now look here. This is the exact same list of ingredients. Again, different parts get different fonts and different styling, but it has a different feel. And now this one, another set of styles and another personality. I want you to look just at that heading, ingredients, and all the different things that are happening. So the one on the left is all lowercase and it's pretty bold. Then the middle one is all uppercase and it's kind of like a stretched out, kind of wide font. And then the one on the right is in title case and it's not that commanding really, except it has a line underneath it. So they all look good enough. They're all functioning, but which would I pick? Well, it depends on the book. What do the different styles say? And what are we trying to say? Type styling itself is a form of communication. When I'm designing, I'm super aware of what the styles I'm choosing between or inventing are expressing. What does it say if I put this part in italics? What about if it was bold? What about if it was in all caps? If I put it in a handwriting font, how will that change how you understand it? The style has an editorial perspective. Okay, so that's some things about type, but I haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet because it's actually space that is the secret ingredient in book design. Space is an organizer. It's a guide, both on the page and as you move through a book. When words or sentences or blocks of text are close to each other spatially, we get that they're close to each other editorially or conceptually. You can see this on this page of poetry where there's 3 stanzas separated by a line space. It's really clear how that page is organized. Okay, my things aren't really working. Think about chapters. What happens at a new chapter? Space. Chapters are almost always begin lower down on a page. The space gives a reader a chance to take a breath. It's a break. It's also a signal. Something new is happening here. Have you ever read a book like this, where the new chapter begins right in line with the previous chapter? Cheaper paperbacks sometimes do this to save money on paper. Space is being used here as a break. You understand what's happening, but you might feel a little cheated. The more space given to the chapter heading, the more of a pause we get and the more separate the chapters feel from each other. Is that an editorial decision? Does the author request it? Or is it something the designer is thinking about and brings? Either can happen. Usually it's the designer. And in every case, how space is used creates a tempo on the page and a rhythmic sense through the book. A new paragraph is marked by a space. An indent or a tab is a space. Where an author breaks a paragraph has meaning, as you guys all well know. Paragraphs are conceptual units, and the tab space is a signal, new unit. Books with long paragraphs feel different than books with a lot of very short paragraphs. Part of that difference is the amount of space there is, and that's both metaphysical space and visual space. One's reflecting the other. How about a section break where there's a skipped line or two? That's a signal. The author is talking to the reader. Here's a break that's bigger than a paragraph, but smaller than a chapter. Those section breaks can be bigger or smaller, depending on how much of a feeling of separation we want. Some books have a really big spaces between the sections and others have a single line. That's an editorial decision again, but who's making it? This is Downton Abbey. You notice anything? There's a lot of space around it. And now let's look at the village near Downton Abbey. You see what I'm saying? The space around an estate tells us something about its status. In the village, everything is close together. And what's true of turn of the century English country homes is true in book design, because putting space around something tells the reader, look at me, I'm important. A common place to see this is in part openers. Parts are usually the highest level in a book, and they're almost always set off with a lot of space. So I can make something noticeable by making it really big, but I can also make something noticeable by giving it a big cushion of space. Okay, now stick with me. In your standard novel or narrative book, the text block or text column is a rectangle. That's because the alignment is fully justified. So it's aligned on both the left and right sides. This makes life easy for a reader because the lines begin in the same place every time and they end in the same place every time. But it's not the only shape that text can be set in. Text can be flush left. That's how it looks in your Word document. The left edge is always the same. The right edge is variable. Text can also be centered. The designer Ellen Lupton says centered text is for wedding invitations and tombstones. It's rarely used for long pieces of text because when both the beginning of the line and the end of the line start in different places on every line, that makes it really tiring to read. Think if you had to read an entire novel in center alignment. And then there's the ugly stepsister, flush right. Text that is flush right has a clean right-hand edge, but every line starts in a new place. Flush right is really annoying to read. Designers only set very short pieces of text in flush right. Right, so let's put it all together. This page has 3 different types of alignment. The name block is justified, the pull quote is ragged, the chapter title is centered. Alignment is a way of using what? Space. Space is what organizes text. If you're ever working on a book with a lot of hierarchy, like with lists and various headings and sidebars, it gets complicated, right? You're hitting that space bar like 20 times in a row. You're putting all these extra hard returns between sections. You're trying to make things make sense through space. That's what we're doing too. It's both the type styling and the use of space that makes this page make sense. And there's a lot going on spatially. Space shows kinship and difference, what goes together and what's separate. I want to point out particularly the length of the lines. Line length is super important, especially when you have a bigger page size. So think about the difference between reading the newspaper and reading a book. A big difference is the length of the lines. Newspapers are meant to be read quickly, and those short lines let that happen. Narrative text, though, you don't want readers to take that in too fast. Books that are meant to be immersive have a longer line, and that slows readers down. So if we go back to this layout, you can see here, the stuff at the top is more narrative, and the stuff below is more referencey. You can skim it. You can see that list, where to find stars in nature. You can just shoot right down it. And lines can get too long. Really long lines are a pet peeve of mine because they're such a chore to read. They're kind of asking you to just skip over them. This comes up for me in cookbook design, where there's usually a really big page and a lot of information to get in. Authors with long recipes sometimes ask to make their lines longer so they can fit everything in. But the problem is we can fit everything in, but no one is going to want to read it. It's super uninviting. Sorry, Deborah Madison, you're awesome, but those lines for your headnotes are ridiculous. So long lines, short lines, tab spaces, the spaces around chapter titles, not to mention sidebars, lists, captions, tables, images. How readers move through a book and the sense they have of its rhythms. Books are organized by space. Okay, like the whole reason I'm even doing this talk is to tell you this. Editors, don't be afraid of hyphens. Justified text is lousy with hyphens. War and Peace, full of hyphens. Nobody has a problem with this. Nobody's worried that readers are going to get confused by the words breaking at the end of the lines. We understand this is one of the tools we use to make reading work. But bring along some ragged text and people go bananas. Is there like a class at editor's school where they teach you that hyphens are bad? This happens all the time with back cover copy. No one wants hyphens on their back cover copy. I'd like to offer a different perspective. Presumably, editors hate hyphens because they think they're ugly, distracting, confusing. I'm not even sure they know why. I would suggest that bad ragging is uglier and more distracting and makes text harder to read. We want the ends of lines to ripple, not create a series of cliff edges or stair steps. As long as words are broken according to sensible guidelines, and of course they have to be, and as long as they're reviewed by an editor or proofreader, of course they have to be. Please leave the hyphens alone. I invite you to join my club, Society for the Defense of Hyphenation, California chapter, which I'm the founder, president, and only current member. Get in touch, I'll send you a bumper sticker. Okay, so I've said a lot about what the designer is thinking. We're picking fonts, we're styling fonts, we're deploying space, but of course, words matter. Designers can do a lot of things, but we're also slaves to the words we're given. This is really clear on covers. One of the most basic aspects of cover design is what's the title? When I hear or read a title for the first time, I think, how many words are there? How long or short are those words? What do the words feel like? What do they look like? Covers with a lot of words to fit need to do something different than books with only a few words. You can't make a cover design like what's on Untamed when you need to fit in all those words that are on Carry On Warrior. Or look at these two. The Allison Roman is a super restrained design. There's only 4 words on that cover. Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat has 4 words in the title alone. And then there's a subtitle and illustration credit. Michael Pollan's name is on there. Over 1 million copies sold and a New York Times bestseller. Both of these designs are effective. They both look great, but you're not going to make the Allison Roman style cover if you've got to fit all those words in. And it can be even more micro. A heartbreaking work of staggering genius, to me, the epitome of a long title. And long titles require different thinking and a different approach than short titles. And even just the length of the words, long words have to be dealt with differently than short words. So there's how many words, how long is the title, how long are the words in the title, and also, what are those words? When thinking about what a cover should look like, I always begin right there. What are the words? What do they feel like? What do they look like? Power, discipline, love, quiet, badass, the number 8. Different words will lead to different visual ideas. And occasionally, the words of a title and the ideas for the design, they're not in sync. Like if you give me a book and the title is Healing from Pain, and the brief is, hey, we want something feel good, uplifting, make it pop. And I'm like, you know, you have the word pain in your title, right? The words matter. This is really obvious on covers, but it's also true inside the book for chapter titles and all the headings in a book. It's really true for all the words in a book. Designers are always responding to the specifics of an author's language. Design is not smoothed on like the icing of a cake. It's baked in. Okay, number 8. The title for the table of contents is Contents. Enough said. Well, actually, I have a lot to say about the table of contents because to me, it's the quintessential element of book design. Now, I know that all books don't have a table of contents, but aside from fiction, most do, and even some fiction does. War and Peace has a monster table of contents. The contents page occurs right at the beginning, and it's a snapshot of the book. It tells the reader what's going to be covered and how it's organized. It's an important piece of information. But it's important in another way too, because it sets the reader up for the book's voice. The words that writers use for their chapter titles and the way they decide to organize their material, it's voicey. And as the designer, I'm always wanting to clue into that voice so that I can show a reader, like in this single spread, this is what you're in for. This is what it's going to be like in here. Look at these 2 examples. Without even reading a word, you've got a lot of information here. You can see that these are 2 different kinds of books. What tells you that? Single words. Someone titles their chapter with short single words. That feels really different than someone whose chapter titles are something like Commentaries on the 14 Mindfulness Trainings. And single words can be set larger, right? And then the larger type also has a different feel than the smaller type will. And other things. Serif fonts feel different than sans serif fonts. All caps feels different from title case. The complexity on the right is a different vibe than the simple structure on the left. And one of these isn't better than the other. They're doing different things. So do you see here how the work of the writer and the editor and the work of the designer overlap? How the sense that the books are different comes from both the editorial choices and the design choices. because the design choices emerge out of the editorial choices, and they're also editorial choices. The table of contents is very meta. Here's some more examples of contents pages. You can see so all these different personalities reflecting different kinds of books. Recently, I was a judge in a book design contest, and we were all sitting around leafing through the books, trying to decide which got first place, which got second, and so on. And I said, if you want to see how good the designer is, look at the table of contents. It's where we show our chops. The table of contents includes basically everything designers think about: how to use space to make relationships clear, how the font and its style shows function and personality, and how to match a visual voice with the author's voice. And when it works, it's all there for the reader right at the beginning. Okay, what does design look like? Some people think it looks like this. Something swirly underneath the chapter title, a cute section break, an exploding butterfly. There's a place for ornamentation in books. Illustrations give us information like this book is romantic or this book is fantastical. Ornamentation can also be used for spatial balance. Ornamentation can be interesting, it can be beautiful, but the inclusion of ornamentation is not evidence of design. I think that non-designers who don't understand the actual work of book design see the inclusion of these kinds of elements as proof that the designer is thinking and that we're working hard. A clean page may seem like we're not really doing very much. That's the thing. For most books, the design is invisible, or it should be. We're working hard to find a design that expresses all the things going on, and we're trying to do it so well that no one notices. When reading, no one should be thinking, oh, this is what the writer is doing, and this is what the designer is doing. For a reader, it should all be one thing. But for you guys, the editors, when you're acting as an editor and not as a reader, it shouldn't be invisible. I hope that when you look at a book, you can see the design, the margins, the placement of the running head, the choice of fonts, the use of space. They're all working towards something. It has a logic, and that's the real work of designers. Okay, last one. Talk to designers earlier. It always seems so weird to me how siloed publishing can be. Like authors aren't allowed to talk to anyone but their editor, and the editor only talks to the art director, but not to the designer. There's this wall. It's like bad etiquette to ask for a phone conversation with the other people who are working on the same book that you're working on. And so there can be a disconnect between the word people and the art and production people. Designers are not asked to be part of editorial conversations, and editors are not totally clear about how what they do impacts what we do. Sometimes I'm really confused by the manuscripts I'm given, and I'm like, shouldn't we have talked about this earlier? I hope I've shown how entwined design is with content, and I hope you can see that one of the things that this might point us toward is a deeper collaboration between editors and authors and designers, and an earlier one. Editors are the bridge between authors and the publishing process, and designers are the bridge between the manuscript and the book it's going to grow up to be. I have so many authors who, once they see their book in design, they're like, oh, that's what I'm doing. That's how it's going to work. It's so valuable. Sample design is a gift. So let that process happen while the important decisions are still being made. Considering design after everything's already been chiseled to perfection is a missed opportunity. And this looks different for different kinds of books, of course. Illustrated books need a lot of conversation early on, but even many text-only books have complex hierarchy. They can have tables or sidebars. Lists are something designers will have an opinion about, or at least I do. Chapter openers and part openers are always useful to talk about early. If there's more than one level of heading, good God, run it by a designer before everything is set in stone. And for many books, a single, probably short conversation is probably plenty, but even this is more than most books get. What are editors doing but helping authors create the best manuscript they can? Let us help you do that. Making books is a team effort. We're collaborators. Let's collaborate. Thank you. That's my talk. I hope it was useful and interesting. The book I've written is called The Design of Books, an explainer for authors, editors, agents, and other curious readers. And there's a lot more information in there. I write about illustrated books. I write about ebooks. There's a whole chapter on cover design. And there's a chapter about the design process. It's something that you could give your authors to help them understand more about the book design of their own books. And I talk also specifically about design in relationship to self-publishing. It's not coming out until spring 2024 because that's how long publishing takes. But if you want to be notified when that happens, you can leave your email on my website. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and we can go to questions. And I think Dave's going to help me do that. So.
Oh my
There we go.
goodness. Thank you,
Hi.
thank you so much. That was so great. And I know that there are going to be a ton of questions because I've already got a ton of things that I want to
Okay.
raise. So I'm sure other people are as well. So because we've got 100 people here, I'd love to be able to open it up to people and just to ask about, we are going to use the chat process. I'm hoping everyone's familiar with that and can go ahead and add to it. I have to say, I think you got at least 100 people signed up for your hyphenation club. I think that's defensive hyphenation. That's so great. I know there's a pet peeve.
I'll
for
send
a
you
lot
out
of
bumper stickers. You send me your address.
Exactly. So, one of the things that I love that you raised is this whole notion of communication, like the whole problem of siloing in publishing. So true. And this is a huge part of what PPN is trying to improve upon, right? Having educating people within publishing, but also across departments in publishing. So this talk is perfect. And I wrote in the chat at one point, like, how about book design for marketing people? Because a lot of the stuff that you were talking about was covers, and often marketing folks are making those decisions. And of course, for authors too, right? So all of that is great. I'm going to go ahead and try to read through some of the questions that people are putting in the chats, but why don't we dive a little bit deeper into some of that typographical stuff. So you talked about hyphenation, and one of the things that you didn't talk about was that hyphenation, that hyphen at the bottom of the right-hand page. Well, a lot of people are really unhappy. Like if you have to turn the page, then it's more of an issue at the end of the line.
No.
So when you say no, you don't care.
No, I care.
You do
So
care.
the thing about hyphenation, let me just say, the thing about hyphenation is that there's rules around hyphenation, and most publishing houses have a house style around hyphenation, and that almost always includes you cannot put a hyphen at the bottom of a page for the facing page, or if you're going to turn the page. Like you never put a hyphenated word is not the last word on a page, and a hyphenated word is usually not the last word in a paragraph if there's only the ending of the word at the end of the paragraph. There's all sorts of rules around hyphenation. So I'm absolutely supportive of those rules. But once those rules are in place and people are paying attention to them, after that, allow the hyphens, because the rag is actually a more important part of creating easy reading than this problem of like, oh, people don't want to look at broken words. They look at broken words all the time. It's not a problem.
Okay, so that leads into one of the questions I was asked: how do you feel about orphans and widows? Because I see a lot of different, some publishers are like absolutely no single line at the bottom, and other publishers are different. So do you have a take on it that you want to share, or any kind of philosophy behind that?
Yeah, so, well, there's two things. One is I really can't keep track of which is the orphan and which is the widow. And when I was writing my book, I was like, I'm going to figure this out once and for all. And I had like 6 different published books with experts in typography talking about widows and orphans. And I was like, okay, well, this person says this. The fact is, like, half the people said widows were the one thing and half the people said orphans were that thing. So it's a little bit in dispute, but whatever, we know what widows and orphans are. So the first line on the bottom, as the first line of a paragraph on the bottom of a page, that's okay. I don't have a problem with that. Most people don't have a problem with that. The end of a short line at the top of a page, that's distracting. That's like a thing that's hard it's all about, is it bothering the reader? It doesn't matter to me. It's not an aesthetic thing. It's like, how is it affecting the reading? And that short line at the top of the page, it's just like, it just makes the text block be confusing. So we try to avoid that. But what I would say is, when you're setting text for a book, a narrative book, there's so many things that we're working on trying to make things right. Hyphenation, the spaces between words on a line, like not being too smushed, not being too spread out, trying to not have widows and orphans. And there's always things that you have to compromise. There's always compromises. And for me, widows and orphans are one of the first things that I'm willing to compromise. Like, I'd much rather have a widow and orphan than have uneven aligned columns at the bottom of my pages. Like, that's never allowed. So if I have to create a widow or an orphan to do that, I can live with that.
Thank you so much. The other thing that I really liked in your talk is you talked about the importance of communication between editors and designers and having that as early as you possibly can. And I think sometimes publishers need to take a more active role in facilitating that process.
Totally.
But obviously designers can kind of ask for that too when they're brought into the process early on. Somebody in the chat asked, what types of conversations should editors and designers have about headers, lists? Should they be more like, what should the headers look like? Or should the question be, should there be different levels of headers at all? I know that one of the things that happens that a designer has to take into account, for instance, is what's the shortest subhead and what's the longest subhead? Because what you don't want is to design a subhead and then find out, oh, now that's 5 lines long. And that's really becomes difficult to fit onto a page. So how much, for instance, pushback should a designer say, like, you've got these subheads that are ridiculously long, is there any way that we can shorten them? Or is it the designer's responsibility to design a subhead that can accommodate this long heading?
I mean, in an ideal world, from my point of view, the designer looks at a manuscript when it's still in process in its Word document form. When I look at a Word document, and I'm looking at the hierarchy and the way that it's structured, I mean, I can just see like, okay, when it's a book, it's just, this is going to be a mess, or this isn't going to work. Just sort of allowing designers to look at manuscripts when they're still in a process where their feedback can be helpful. So if I see that and I'm like, wow, there's 4 levels of headings, there's 5 levels of headings, or the headings are inconsistent, as you're saying, that's often a problem. For me to be able to give that feedback, like, that's not going to work very well in the book. So you might want to think about that instead of, once the book is already finished and it's handed over to me and I'm like, now I have this, and I'm like, well, how am I supposed to, deal with these headers that are inconsistent, or I have so many levels of hierarchy, that's really not going to work. And then having to reverse engineer it for both the author and the editor, it's so inefficient. Like, let's talk about structure. Designers are so tuned in to the structure. Like, that's what we're doing, is like making the structure clear. So if you can bring in designers to talk about structure at an early point, then it's so much more efficient. Then you can like work that out together when your things are still in process, they feel fluid. And by the time you get to the design, not only is it going to be a smoother design process, but actually the book is going to work better, because when things are structured more tightly, it's better for the reader. So that's what I would say about that.
I know that sometimes some editors that I've worked with have been remarkable in that as they're going through their editing process, they will produce actually sort of a design memo, not instructional, but content-wise for the designer, saying, hey, there are 3 levels of heads. Here's the shortest instance. Here's the longest instance. We have these lists. That kind of thing, I think, is incredibly helpful for the designer. And I've never heard of a designer who's like, I don't want that. That sounds great.
Yeah.
The other thing in terms of the series of communication that you were talking about, like earlier is better. I know that sometimes I worked on a design and then the manuscript that arrives to be typeset is actually substantially altered from the one that I designed from, right? So all of a sudden there are 3 new different kinds of sidebars that hadn't been before. So having that kind of also follow-up communication, do you want to talk about that at all?
I mean, that's totally true. That absolutely happens. And, that's maybe an argument, like if you do the sample design too early and the author is still really developing the book, and it turns out to be something that's pretty different from the early sample design, then that's going to be what happens. So, I guess there's a compromise. There's a continuation of communication. So the editor is the pivot point between the author and the designer. And the editor knows that the designer has done a sample design based on this. And the editor also knows things have really changed. And at that point, they could say, hey, the designer, it turns out like they ended up doing this instead. want to do a revised sample design so that we can see that in process. I mean, that's really, it's a communication issue, but yeah, that's something that certainly happens. And then you're just like, okay, wait, this has nothing to do with the thing that I made already.
Linda asked in the chat about something that you didn't touch on yet, which is captions. She points out the pet peeve of like sometimes captions are too similar to the basic text design.
Okay, what's the question?
How do you approach captions in design? I mean, do you want to just talk about that at all? And also maybe there are obviously very different kinds of captions. One can be like, oh, it's a simple label, and other ones are incredibly descriptive, and how to design for that. So for instance, you get these descriptive captions that can be just incredibly long, and very hard to design in a way that's inviting to the reader. I know that I often say to authors who are not descriptive in their captions, like, provide a little bit more, because in the bookstore, someone's opening up this book, they see this really interesting graphic, and then this caption that doesn't say anything. But here's an opportunity to invite the reader, the casual reader who's just picked up your book, into the book.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say that is connected to the designer has to understand the relationships that they're designing for, which is like what I was talking about with the typographic styles. Like when I have to really know what's happening, what kind of captions are these? Are these short, just like titles? Are they long descriptive captions? Like I need to really understand the organization and the sort of logic of the manuscript to be able to design for it appropriately. And in terms of captions just sort of not being differentiated enough, I mean, what we're doing is we're using type to show function and to show relationships. So if your captions aren't differentiated enough, typographically, maybe they're differentiated enough spatially. So that's another way of differentiating, is through space instead of just through typography. Or maybe they're not differentiated enough and they're not showing their function strongly enough, in which case you could say, hey, this is not a strong enough contrast. It's not clear.
Okay. A number of people brought up what should be happening in the manuscript, right? The text file, and what shouldn't be happening. In other words, what can the author and or the editor be doing in the Word document to help the designer, but also not be too proscriptive? I know that one of the issues, for instance, that comes up a lot is if they see a design sample and they see that one of the designs is possibly like an all caps subhead, they'll go in and change the text to all caps. And I'm like, no. You don't need to do that. That's a design feature now. Please don't do that. Leave it the way that it should be done editorially to distinguish in terms of title capitalization. Do you have any advice for authors and editors, I think, at this point, in terms of what should be happening in that Word doc that's going to be coming to you?
Yeah, well, two things. One is never, ever, ever put your chapter titles or headings in all caps. That's something that the designer is going to do. And when you do that, we have to like undo that. And that's a very unpleasant thing to do. So it should always be in title case or sentence case. One of the things I thought about talking about, which I didn't talk about because it's technical and complicated, is tagging or coding. And to me, tagging or coding is the communication of many of those things from the editor to the designer. The tags, the codes, do people understand what I mean when I say tags and codes? Yeah. That's telling me what the structure of the book is, what the relationships of things are to each other. And then I can use those to create a style that makes sense typographically or spatially. But one of the problems that we have is that sometimes the manuscripts that come to me, the coding is kind of sloppy. Like maybe the entire front matter is just like text, or like a list. I mean, lists are complicated. The coding, the more tightly done the coding is and the more detailed, like to me, the best coding would say first line would be a code for first line in a list, then the rest of the items in the list, then the last line item in a list. Those would be 3 separate codes. And I would understand, this is the first, this is the body, this is the end. And like, you know, a paragraph that's after a chapter title has a different code than the paragraphs that are all in the rest of the body copy, or a paragraph that comes after a section break has a different code. To me, the coding is the communication, and I really use that to understand what's happening. And if it's sloppy or if it's incomplete, I can spend a lot of time just trying to figure it out. Like, well, what's happening here? Is that an epigraph or is that a subtitle? I'm not sure, you know? So I can't remember what the question was, but coding.
Yeah, maybe at some point you can touch on the coding and tagging a little bit later. I mean, I think there are lots of different ways to do that, and so it might be a whole subject unto itself. And
It is.
and certainly self-published authors might not be familiar with this. Publishers probably are. Which brings me to another question that someone raised in terms of that dynamic between author, editor, and designer. We talked about it within the publisher the sort of framework, but what if there's a self-publishing author? So you don't have the traditional sort of more professional publisher who's sort of setting stuff up. How does an editor or a designer work with an author who might not be as familiar with the process of that communicating? So someone wrote, authors who are truly self-publishing may contract separately with the editor and then the designer. And as a designer, you know, communicates with the author, but not the editor necessarily. And sometimes it just sort of arrives. Is there any suggestions on how to bridge the divide in self-publishing?
I mean, those are good questions. The whole process around self-publishing is interesting and complicated. I do have a whole chapter about that in my book, so I wrote a lot about that. I mean, part of it is educating authors who are not professionally in publishing about what the process is and what people's roles are and how they can best help editors and designers create the best book for them. So I would say that, first of all, in terms of an author who hires an editor and then hires a designer, yes. I mean, if I was that author, I would put that editor and that designer together, because they're really, the editor is the person that's going to finish the manuscript, create the manuscript, code the manuscript. And really, you know, I would rather be in conversation with the editor than the author in terms of the details of the mechanics, not in terms of like what the book is, but in terms of the mechanics. So if it was me as a self-publishing author and I have my sort of people, I would absolutely put the editor and the designer in direct contact with each other.
Another question is there a trend toward much smaller type? I'm assuming they mean text type. I see mainstream books with type size that reads as tiny. I know I remember one of the first text designers I got to know is like, everything should be tiny. And then now as I'm older and my eyes are failing, I'm like, should it? I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
I totally agree with you. I actually had something in the talk about size of fonts at one point and I took it out. Designers tend to like smaller type. Editors tend to not want you to have smaller type. And for me, as I've aged, I've really understood more that the type should be a little bigger, but I would say I still sometimes err on a little bit of a too small. And that's a conversation I have with editors. I often have editors come back to me and be like, can you bump it up a half a point? I'm like, oh yeah, okay. And I used to feel like small type looked better, but now I really think a good designer can make every kind of type look good. I mean, one of the things is we don't want a book for adults to look like it's for children. Like, so there's a certain point when a book starts to look childish because the type is too big and that doesn't look good. But like as long as you keep it within the realm of adult, a good designer should be able to make that look good and shouldn't have to stay with like tiny type. Yeah.
Andrea asked a question that I think could be its own session as well. What weight do you think book buyers, marketers, sales teams, and publicists should have in cover design? And there may be a subtext there, none.
So cover design is its own topic. I think I am going to develop a talk about cover design because it's so interesting. I mean, I love to talk about cover design. And, you know, I'm the designer. I feel like marketing and buyers and all those people can hijack design to its detriment. I think when there's design by committee and there's a lot of micromanaging of design, you're usually going to end up with a worse cover. But there's a lot to say about that, and I don't think I can really talk about it in the next 30 seconds. But yes, that's certainly an issue. Design by committee, it's very sad. It can be tragic.
Someone asks sort of a technical question. Besides InDesign, is there software that you recommend? Affinity has recently come out, very affordable alternative. Quark was obviously a predecessor. Do you have any advice for folks on the technical end?
I mean, I would say that for professional design, InDesign is absolutely the industry standard. If I came into contact someone who was using something other than InDesign, I would just be like, that doesn't make any sense to me. All the printers, everybody's using InDesign. Even Quark, I haven't talked to someone who used Quark in 15 years. But I would say that for self-publishing, there is a software which I have in my book, and I'm maybe not going to be able to remember what it's called right now.
Affinity?
No.
No.
And it's an interior design software. I looked at a lot of different interior design softwares and interior design processes when I was writing for self-publishing. And there was one, maybe I can give it to you and you can send it to somebody to send it to everybody at some point, because I'm not gonna be able to think of it. But there was one that seemed clearly better than all the others. And the reason that it was better was because it was very limited in its choices. Like, it only offered good choices. And like, people who may use templates that go into Word or use these sort of like convoluted word processing / we're going to make your ebook for you apps. It's just, you have to be a designer to be able to like deal with those. They're so complicated. There's so many bad choices you can make. So when you have this one software, which just like, it really keeps it very limited and very tight. And it seemed to me to be making pretty decent books. Books that are not designed, that are typeset by non-designers, it's always obvious to me, like, you're just not going to be able to create a designed book when you learn it in a month. Like, it just isn't going to happen. But there's better and there's worse. And there is this one app that's better. But in terms of professional design, InDesign, I've never heard of Affinity. I don't know anything about that.
Okay. We're at 6:30 now. Are you okay with going on a little bit longer on
Sure.
Q&A? Okay. Yep. So somebody is asking a question that gets back to the codes and tags, which is, should editors style manuscripts using word, paragraph, and character styles?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, totally. So there's 3 ways to do tags. One is the old way where you would actually type the tag in, like with carets on either side, into the manuscript. Mostly that's going away, and it should be going away. It's better than having no tags, but it's the least good. And the sort of most accessible way is to use styles in Word, and styles in Word work beautifully with InDesign. If you do them correctly, when I bring that manuscript into InDesign, all those styles just come up for me in my styles. Love it. And then people in big publishing houses, like if you're Penguin Random House or something like that, they have their own XML style thing where they put it through a whole thing and it creates an XML thing. And then when we bring in the manuscript, again, it just it does the same thing that Word does. It creates all those styles of the paragraph of the text come up for me. And in that way, it's like every single thing I can see, oh, this is this is the intention of all these pieces of text. Those are clear. And yes, editors should absolutely be completely using Word styles. They should be using them completely. They should be like creating new styles if they need to. Very pro Word styles.
And of course, this gets back to the communication component, right? Because maybe not every designer works the way that you do and might have a different take on it and suggest something different. So having that, and they're not worth anyone's time, but there could be designers out there. Someone asks, how do you handle critiques and criticism from authors and/or editors who don't understand design during the cover design process?
Well, I wrote a book about it. That's how I dealt with it, because I spent 20 years being frustrated about it. And I was like, hey, it's a pandemic. I think I'm going to write a book about this. This is the thing that I think about that. Authors are the experts on their book, and we're the experts at design. So there's absolutely a place for authors and editors within the design process, including the cover design process. But all of that places at the front end. So give your ideas, let's have a conversation, tell me all the things that you think. Awesome, like great. But then once it comes to me, I'm the expert in the design, you're not. And so let me bring my expertise to you. Let me like use my expertise to make the best thing that I can for you. It's like, for me, publishers who allow their authors to sort of dictate and micromanage design, they're really doing them a disservice because they're not experts at publishing and they're not experts at design. They are experts, but it's in their subject matter. So give the authors the benefit of the expertise that you're bringing. And yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Someone brought up a really interesting point that I think happens a lot, and this is both true, I think, for cover design and for interior design, which is that often we are looking at design, even though you started your talk talking about this is about printed books, without ever seeing the printed samples, right? So they're looking, and then when they get the book, they're, oh my God, the type is tiny, because they were looking at it on their big screen at 300% magnification. What kind of advice do you give to both editors and authors, or anyone who's going to be reviewing the design in terms of printing it out? I know that one time I wrote to an author and I said, be sure to print this out, and that when you do, that it's printing out at 100% and not something different. And they respond by saying, I don't have a printer. So that was a tough one.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. The entire workflow is digital. Proofs are digital. All the galleys are digital. All the corrections I'm getting is all on PDFs. We're all looking at, I'm creating everything on my screen. So yes, and that is misleading. My design, especially when I'm doing my sample design, I always print everything out. Every element needs to be printed out. Not every page, but every element needs to be printed out, and I need to be able to review that on the page, printed out on my printer, because as you say, it's not the same. And I always send sample design and first galleys with crop marks, and I say to my editor and the authors, please print at least some pages out at 100% and look at them in print. If you don't have a printer, send it to Kinko's. Like, there's a way to get things printed. It's absolutely an important part. You definitely do not want to see the first time you've ever seen your typography in print when you have that bound book. Like, that's crazy. So yes, that's an important part of understanding what's happening with your book, is seeing it at some point printed. And as I said, it doesn't have to be every page. It just has to be a representative sample.
And a couple of people thought that maybe the software you were talking about was either Vellum or Atticus.
Vellum. Thank you. Yeah, Vellum.
Okay. Excellent. And I think there are probably some other questions that I'm skipped, but we're at 6:30. I don't want to go too long. But I'm just seeing if there's anything. I think that's basically, there are lots of notes in the chat about cover design and how you should do the whole separate topic on that, and all these other things that we've only touched on that clearly, well, they're probably a chapter in your book, right? So people need to buy that book, but hopefully you'll do more sessions with us, and I can't thank you enough. I am gonna just kind of wrap it up by saying thank you to Debbie Berne for coming to us with this topic, saying that, I've written this book and would this be of interest? And immediately, of course, we said yes. And the fact that this had so many people signing up for it just shows what an interesting topic it is. I also want to say that if you are interested in joining PPN, the URL is in the chat, pubpronetwork.org. We have a conference coming up in April, a book show in the fall, lots going on in between. We really hope that either you become a member because it's so reasonable, or at the very least that you sign up to get on our email list. We try not to abuse it too much. We only send out interesting things and we try to share them. So this is all about community. And Debbie, thank you for working so hard to make this community a better one, a happier one.
Thank you so much. Thank you, PPN, for hosting. And thanks everyone for coming. I hope it was useful and interesting. So thank you.
Yay.